Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to the highs and lows of drug decriminalization. My name is Isabella Daugiallo, and I am a first-year student from Los Angeles. I hope to major in global studies and public policy and have been serving as an event ambassador for the IOP this quarter. For today's event, we have many renowned speakers, starting with Kassandra Frederique, who is the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, someone who has worked tirelessly with a consistent focus on racial justice. She was the architect for the campaign that cut the number of New York City marijuana arrests by more than 99% since 2010. We will also hear from Tera Hurst, the Executive Director of the Health Justice Recovery Alliance. She is currently helping to lead the effort to implement Ballot Measure 110, which would reduce penalties for drug possession and fund a new drug addiction treatment and recovery grant program. Joining us as well is Denver City Councilwoman Robin Kniech. She has advocated for many policies aimed at mitigating homelessness and expanded housing protections against discrimination based on source of income. Mona Zhang, our moderator, is currently the state's policy reporter for Politico. She is well established in her field. She both founded and helped edit the cannabis newsletter Word on the Tree. She also spent over 4 years writing on cannabis information for news organizations such as Forbes, The Outline, High Times, and more. Before the speakers begin, please make sure to silence your phones. During the event, someone will place a microphone in the audience when it is time for the Q&A. Please line up, and as usual, we give priority to the first students to ask questions. Be sure to keep up to date with the upcoming events at the IOP. This Monday, November 7th, the International Policy Program will welcome Volodymyr Sheyko, the Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, at 12 p.m. in the IOP House. We will also be having an election night watch party at Ida Noise from 7 to 10 p.m. next Tuesday. If you're curious about any upcoming speaker events at the IOP or just different ways to get involved, please be sure to check out the website. One final thing before we begin, we are 7 days out from Election Day. UChicago is holding early voting November 2nd through November 4th at campus on Reynolds Club. You can register right at the polls, just don't forget to bring your ID and proof of address. For more information about voting, please check out ushivotes.com. Now, please give a warm welcome to our speaker and moderator, Mona Zhang, Kassandra Frederique, Tera Hurst, and Robin Kniech.
Thank you all for coming out today, and for UChicago for having us. I guess to start out, I want to go to you, Kassandra. I mean, you've been in drug policy for a long time, and we're just coming up now on the 10-year anniversary of the first U.S. states, Colorado and Washington, to legalize marijuana. So how have you seen the sort of trajectory of cannabis legalization and reform? What's that been like over the past decade, and how has it changed?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to see so many people here today. I think when we think about the last 10 years of cannabis, it's actually been very exciting. Exciting because the kinds of things that we thought possible 10 years ago have actually exploded, right? We are in a place where more than 30 states have some version of regulated cannabis, including medical, 19 states that have regulated cannabis. And we're in a moment where people are arguing more about how we regulate cannabis versus if we should regulate cannabis. Mm-hmm. We're in a moment where there are 2 states in this election cycle where there are pro-cannabis advocates who are running against the cannabis initiatives, right? And that's because as cannabis advocates have built campaigns over the last decade, they have more opinions about what it should look like. And people have really strong positions about how we structure regulation. And that puts us in a really exciting, innovative, imaginative space. And a lot of people are recognizing that cannabis policy is about so much more than access to the plant. So I think as I've seen the description of what we thought cannabis reform could do versus what we want cannabis reform to do now, I think it's really it really fulfills this idea of someone who's worked on drug policy for a long time, that drug policy, yes, is about our response to drugs, but it's about so much more. And it gives us the opportunity to really build out a future that doesn't have to rely on the kinds of tenets or theories that have undergirded the drug war in general, which are the theories of social control, racism, sexism, and the ways that racialize capitalism. And so we're really in this moment where people are agitating and being more prescriptive about what freedom looks like.
Mm-hmm. And Robin, you've had like a front row seat to what it looks like on the ground to really implement some of these measures that advocates have helped pass. In your time working on implementing cannabis policies, how has the debate shifted even in like Colorado itself or even in the city of Denver? Because I feel like how the cannabis industry looks now in Colorado is very different from, 5-10 years ago.
Well, thank you for having me. Happy to be here. When the industry started to form around medical marijuana, it was kind of a gray time where it was decriminalized, but there wasn't rules around where stores could go or how they should operate or where they would get their supplies from. And then we moved into kind of a regulated period right before recreational marijuana was legalized. So we really have had 3 different eras in our period of time, longer than 10 years, actually, 20 years for us. And during my time in office, I was elected in 2011, right before recreation was voted in by the voters. The industry, and I say the industry somewhat intentionally, right, was saying, regulate us like alcohol. That was the rally cry. And so if you give us rules and you give us taxation, then we'll be like everyone else. We'll be legitimate. And so now, of course, we have a very advanced, I think, strong regulatory regime, but it is almost crushing for small businesses, for minority-owned businesses. It can be very expensive to operate. We have a new SAFE requirement because we had a lot of theft involving driving a vehicle into the store, smashing it, and stealing everything. So now we have these car-proof safes we're requiring people to have. It makes them safer, but they're really expensive. So we actually are now debating how much too much regulation can be and how it can be a barrier. We're also talking a lot about product safety, right? What is the potency of what you're buying and how do we ensure you're getting what you thought you bought? Some of the early debates have faded a little bit for some. Youth usage. The assumption and the rallying cry of opponents is that this will increase, if you decriminalize a substance, youth usage will go through the roof. We have 10 years of very solid data that shows that youth in Colorado used a little more marijuana than the national average before legalization. They continue to use a little bit more than the national average, but their use has not increased due to legalization. So in some ways, we've busted some myths. And it doesn't mean we still don't end up talking about them in the policy arena. We do. But we're now talking about psychedelics in Colorado, and we are certainly talking about other opioid challenges far more than we are about cannabis. Cannabis is kind of a business debate a lot of times.
And Tera, could you tell us a bit more about what Measure 110 was and how has sort of these gains in cannabis policy reform impacted broader discussions of drug policy reform and decriminalization?
Yeah, excuse me. Thanks for having me. So Measure 110 was passed by the voters in November 2020 by a 17-point margin. And basically what it did was decriminalized a small personal use of possession. So anywhere from a gram of heroin, small personal possession. And instead of getting a misdemeanor, you now get a ticket similar to a speeding ticket or a traffic ticket. And the other part of Measure 110 was investing cannabis revenue, so thank you, into what we call the Drug Treatment and Recovery Fund. And that's basically diverting this biennium $302 million into the Drug Treatment and Recovery Fund, and recognizing that Oregon is unique in 2 pretty horrific ways. One is that we are 50th in the nation in access to services and addiction services, and we are second in the nation in addiction rates. So we're doing horribly on both. So having $302 million to invest in harm reduction and addiction services has been and will be, because it has taken a while to implement, as any big policy shift does, will be transformational for our communities. We really focused on communities that have been most impacted by the war on drugs, ensuring that, as we all know, the war on drugs really eviscerated communities, sending folks to jail, breaking apart families, breaking apart communities, putting barriers to employment, housing, banks, going to school, being able to qualify for college loans, everything that we expect in society for you to be successful, we took away from large swaths of our communities. And so we're really trying to make sure that these funds go to those communities in ways of housing, peer support, mentors, harm reduction. And I think that we wouldn't be in this position, A, if we hadn't had pioneers in the beginning 20 years ago talking about cannabis, even in a medical space, and Oregon's been one of the early adopters as well, to start destigmatizing use, right? And destigmatizing first cannabis and now saying, okay, the sky didn't fall. We're actually, I would argue, better off. What if we take it the next step and start decriminalizing people who either have a substance use problem, they should be getting health care, not criminal justice responses to substance use, but also for people who do use substances in a way that isn't harmful to themselves or to their community, they shouldn't be at risk of going to jail, having lifelong barriers to their record. So I think that the conversations that have happened over the last couple decades and where we are today, we wouldn't have been able to have this conversation in Oregon. I don't think Oregonian voters recognize the injustice of putting people in jail for healthcare issues. They also recognize that we needed services and access to services. So it's a really exciting time for us to be able to implement. And as if anybody's seen any media on Oregon lately, they may think that Measure 110 was a colossal failure, but ultimately it's just like what we experienced in early adoption of any type of policy. It takes time, you have to be thoughtful, and you're gonna have debates for years and decades probably, but you also have to really hang in there and make sure that you're going the distance, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Kassandra, how have you seen this debate play out on a more national level in terms of how cannabis policy reform has maybe opened people up to thinking about psychedelics or just drug decriminalization in general?
I think one of the biggest through points and one of the biggest transformative lenses that went through cannabis policy and what we're seeing is a conversation about how we respond to drugs. I think one of the things that really shifted the way we have conversations about cannabis is when we really started talking about cannabis enforcement. Cannabis enforcement really shifted the way that people thought how to put cannabis policy together. And because so much of the conversation in the public has focused on enforcement and policing, how expensive it is, how it doesn't help people stop using drugs, it doesn't help people from stopping to get drugs. If you poll people in the US, the overwhelming majority of people believe that the war on drugs is a failure. So if people are starting from that standpoint, then when we have conversations about cannabis policy, which is the drug that most people have used or tried, and we show that you can do a different way, and then we have a conversation where it's the same reasons why you don't want law enforcement to engage people with cannabis are the same reasons why you don't want people to be engaged with the police for other substances. People start making connections, especially if we're telling people, hey, like in Oregon, where it was we don't want you to arrest people, we want you to give people access to services. People already think it's a failure, and now you're offering people a different suggestion of something that they can grab onto. And so I think that because the US, majority of Americans believe that the war on drugs is a failure, we have a lot of room, not a lot of room, we have some room to innovate about what policy looks like. I think that it's really important to recognize that cannabis policy, it took a lot of focus on, one, that medical marijuana had come through, but also, even if you look at how we started to get bigger news outlets to support it, more social justice and racial justice groups to support it, a lot of that was tied to policing. Psychedelics is a different animal, right? Psychedelics is taking on is moving super fast, the decriminalization of psychedelics. And part of the reason why it's moving super fast is because people are having the other part of the conversation of drugs, right? Exploration, fun, right? The supports that people have around navigating serious trauma. Psychedelics they're more in the space of wellness, right? Cannabis had that a little bit when it was talking about medical cannabis and pain management, but psychedelics conversation about wellness is a little bit more expansive. And so I think people are really interested in that, especially the kinds of people that have access to psychedelics who are really shifting the debate very quickly because of the resources that they also have, right? And then the conversation around all drug decriminalization with my sister in arms, Tera, is harder because people recognize that the war on drugs has failed, but they're still very scared because so much of the information about drugs is false, it's sensationalized. I mean, how many did people go trick-or-treating yesterday? You don't have to raise your hand. Some of y'all did. But how long have you been hearing about rainbow fentanyl, right? How long have you been hearing about drugs being in your candies, right? There are still very deep fears that people have around drugs, which really shape how fast we'll be able to go to decriminalizing other substances that people are not yet comfortable with. And part of the reason why people are not yet comfortable with is that not that many people use those drugs, right? So people use cannabis, there are people that use psychedelics, but there are not as many people that are experimenting with heroin, right? There are people, but it's not the same kind of relationship where you go to a party. Now, you might go to a party and see Coke, but and that's still a different conversation, right? But I think that as we're having the conversation about broader drug decriminalization, a lot of it's gonna be focused around what is people's connection to it, what is their information about it, and when we talk to folks, they're like, yeah, we should decriminalize drugs. But what people think when we say decriminalize drugs, when we start naming drugs, people get really scared. And so what it shows us is that in this conversation, there's a lot of need for public education about substances, what do people know, and how do we support people as we move towards a place where we move out of criminalizing drug use and drug involvement and into a place where we can actually move to regulation, safe supply, and also building out different ways that we respond to drugs.
Mm-hmm. I want to get back to some of the stuff you said about psychedelics later, but touching on the point you made about enforcement in cannabis, at the beginning of these legalization debates, like in Colorado, it was very much like regulate marijuana like alcohol type of messaging, and now we've seen it evolve so much to focus on social equity and community reinvestment, and really trying to repair the harms of marijuana enforcement in certain communities. So Robin, can you tell us a little bit more about how that conversation has evolved in Colorado? Because it wasn't that present at the forefront at the beginning when there first was legalization, but now you see the legislature passing social equity bills and Denver is trying to implement its own social equity program. So how has that journey been?
Well, it's certainly a credit to particularly Black leaders who really wanted to be in the space and either were excluded because of criminal background limitations in the early laws, right? And also the capital that it takes to get into this industry. I described one example of how expensive it can be. And so they really led the way using democracy to their advantage to get the attention of elected officials we took a conservative approach as one of the first states doing this, and so I'm not sure we would have passed it if social equity had been at the forefront at that time. At that time, it was, we're going to keep anyone with a criminal background out. These will be good guys, and those people were bad guys, and we're keeping them separate. And now we understand how very exclusionary that was. And so I think that it is also a credit to the other states that were far enough along that when they took these things to the ballot, they already knew what we'd done wrong. And so we actually were catching up with them now as they passed their laws 3, 5, 7 years after we did. One thing I never thought would pass, it was always, maybe yes, we would have better laws for people with backgrounds in marijuana, that they would, illegal charges would be able to come into the legalized industry. I kind of thought that would fall, and it has. I never would have thought I'd be telling you we're putting public dollars, tax dollars, into the industry, and we are. We now have capital funds at both the state and the city to help entrepreneurs. We cannot be race conscious. There's a lot going on with our Supreme Court this week, in fact, around race conscious policies, but we're focusing on those who have histories in neighborhoods that were targeted, those with charges and family history that we hope will include BIPOC communities, and we are literally funding them to enter into this industry. And I never would have thought that was possible, but it's a sign of, I think, how very seriously state and city governments are trying to reckon with racial equity in a tough industry kind of way.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I think what's so exciting about the point you're making about public dollars, and what often we say is like, they put public dollars into enforcing a law that was illegitimate, right? So if you put the public dollars to find us, to criminalize us, and you should put the public dollars in to find us so that we can make money in the industry that we've created, right? And so really getting, I think the things that are so exciting about cannabis policy and the kind of advocacy that's happening is that you're seeing people that have been most harmed tell the government, no, we're gonna change the rules, right? We actually, the rules were always illegitimate. So now if we're moving something above board towards regulation, we don't have to use the rules that you've used before because it's a new industry, it's a new opportunity. And I think what you're seeing in cannabis policy is it's super iterative, which is what's really exciting about policymaking.
Yeah, and I want to explore the fact that something you mentioned at the beginning, the fact that there are pro-marijuana, pro-cannabis advocates who are advocating against some of these ballot initiatives. And the initiatives that they're advocating against are mostly industry funded, very heavily funded by existing medical marijuana industries in Missouri and Arkansas. How have you seen funding for advocacy change in this space throughout the years, and how do you think that's impacting the debate?
I think funding is really difficult to follow. It takes a lot of money and resources to run campaigns. And I think it's also really important to remember that most of the cannabis laws that passed first were referendums, right? So they were ballot initiatives. It takes millions of dollars to run a ballot initiative. I think Colorado took like 6, 7 million for.
I don't have that.
Yeah, well, I know for us it was like $8 million to do Measure 110. And you don't always get that from small donations, right? From like grassroots groups or like college students, no shade. But like, you need money, and you need people with money who believe in the thing that you need. And you need to get them to be like, hey, I'm going to write you a big check for something that might not win. Like, so the people that are funding ballot initiatives are people that are super well-resourced, who like the risk, right? So there's some ego in there, and are super committed, right? For cannabis, in the beginning, a lot of it was individuals who felt like this was wrong, we're gonna do something different. Very wealthy people. And we were going to the states that they lived in, like they had self-interest in it. Some of them also had like the larger social justice things, but a lot of them had self-interest. Then you have But we've moved out of that place, right? In 2016, once California went, that was considered the big fish. Getting California over the big line at one of the most populous states, one of the biggest industries, getting them into a regulated market was the big fish. And you saw the individual donor funding for cannabis go down. And the thing about it is that philanthropy, foundations, have not really funded cannabis reform like that. So now we're in a moment where we believe, like, we have now done all this work, an industry has sprouted up from our social justice work. They don't actually need us as much because they've gotten their own lawyers, they got their own lobbyists, they got their own drafters. And so they're creating and writing laws that social justice organizations used to write and we used to be funded for. And now we're struggling to be able to continue to maintain the relationships and the power and the higher ground to get our bills off the line, but we also need money to get those bills passed, right? It can be different and a little bit easier for grassroots organizations to be on more equitable footing if they're moving through a legislature, right? Because you've been working in that space longer, they have the same hours that you have. They might not have the same ability to give political donations, but we have the same hours. But they can outspend you or out-fundraise you in an initiative process. And so what you're seeing now is that the industry is writing their own initiatives, they're running their campaigns, and they're basically like, it's time to legalize cannabis by any means necessary. But the issue is that in the social justice space, that window of by any means necessary is over. The advocacy community is very clear about what are the kinds of things that they want. So now we're in a space where like, no, we know that we can legalize cannabis. We're not at your mercy or your money, so we will actively block it. Can they always block it? I did in New York, but not in many places can people do that, especially in a referendum situation where you're not dealing with a small group of electeds, but you're dealing with an electorate, right? Mm-hmm. So I think part of the thing that you're seeing here is that people are realizing that the industry is writing the rules for themselves where they benefit, where they lock other people out, where they kind of play to the rules of the first generation of cannabis reform, and people are saying like, no, that's not okay. So now people have more opinions, and it's not like throwing something up on the wall and seeing if it sticks. Everyone's like, no, we have a particular way that we want cannabis reform to move, and if the industry is going to lead it, if the industry is going to fund it, people are navigating what is the ideology and the purity around it, and will this actually get us to a different place? Or is it going to do what people constantly talk about in cannabis, which is make a small group of people who have not been impacted by the drug war very, very wealthy?
Yeah, I think we're seeing that, sort of fear of like big marijuana or corporate cannabis across the country, in a lot of states, and even at the federal level. And I wonder if, Tera, in your work, like whether there is fear of like a big psychedelics industry, or, right now there are a lot more, publicly listed psychedelics companies, and I feel like there's a lot of crossover in terms of cannabis entrepreneurs who are like looking for the next big thing. And do you worry if that sort of like emergence of those business interests is going to impact the kind of work that you guys do?
I'm not worried from a Measure 110 standpoint because we're probably so far from that, right? Of what the next steps are from decriminalization. I think ballot measure 109, which I'm going to tell you I don't know a whole lot about, at the same time as 110 went through, it also passed, which legalized psilocybin. And so there are rulemakings happening, and there's a lot of conversation around there. I don't know why it would be different. We are in a capitalist society, and when we find a way to make money, legitimately or illegitimately, we do it. And then we get really good at it and leave a lot of people behind. So my sense would be is that's the course of action. The piece that I feel hopeful on is that we do have a lot more information. We have a lot more understanding of how to work in these markets and how how to not necessarily pick winners and losers, but how to really figure out ways in investing in entrepreneurship, investing in making sure that folks who have been most impacted by the war on drugs have access to these opportunities. And ultimately, I think that as we still stay in a capitalist society, this is going to be our trajectory until or if we ever shift, right? So, and I don't see that happening anytime soon.
May I add something real quick?
Yeah.
I do think there is a risk for advocates because to the extent there are people who are still relitigating whether we should decriminalize at all, and they do still exist, and they're large enough to make an impact in policy debates, maybe not to win them, but to change the tenor of them, they seize on that language of big cannabis in order to sow fear about decriminalization. And so, I always describe the most challenging situation is where the far right absorbs talking points from our progressive friends and turns them on their head for nefarious purposes. And this is an example where I do see that happening, and them actually saying, we shouldn't decriminalize because you're going to have huge corporate drug rings that work like big tobacco to lure kids into using these drugs, just like big tobacco does. And that does give people pause then about legalization. So I think that it's an interesting moment of risk for the movement that you're describing about how your concerns are being co-opted by your opponents.
That's right. Yes. And also and then it gets into a space where people in our space are like, we actually need to actively block big tobacco and big alcohol from being in cannabis, right? Which feels really difficult, right? But people are like, no, they actually can't come because we want to build a regulatory model that's different than this. Like the overdose crisis that we're navigating, we also don't want to act like big pharma either, right? And so I think that's why you're also hearing a lot of people in cannabis talk about small businesses, small farmers. But I think there's also an industry in the drug policy space. People talk about big tobacco, talk about big alcohol, big cannabis. And they also are starting to talk about, the fears of big psychedelics. But I think there's another industry that people never talk about. And that is directly one of the biggest things that we navigated in Oregon, which is big treatment. Big treatment. Those treatment facilities, a lot of them have people in their beds because they are court mandated, because the criminal justice system creates clients for them. And so they are very scared when we push for decriminalization because they are worried about their bottom line. And I say that as someone who has a degree in social work and is therefore someone who would be a part of the treatment space. People are motivated to keep criminalization in place because it keeps their doors open. If you look at a place like Baltimore, Maryland, at the height of COVID, the state attorney general at the time, Marilyn Mosby, decided in COVID, listen, we cannot keep arresting people for low-level issues because it's COVID. We don't want people in congregate housing. So I am no longer going to prosecute people for low-level drug possession. She puts out an op-ed. People are like, this is smart. Drug possession is the #1 arrest in this country. Do you know who wrote the opposition op-ed? One of the treatment facilities in Baltimore, Maryland. And they said, this is terrible. We have workers too. What are they gonna do? And I was like, wait a minute, I thought slavery was, so y'all still creating industry on the capture and subjugation of people so that you can make money, not so you can help people, right? And so in Oregon, when we were fighting for Measure 110, part of the things that people were saying was like, well, we can't decriminalize because then they'll never go to treatment. And I was like, well, why don't you make treatment more incentivized? Why don't you believe in your model that people can choose to go get help? Why is it that you feel like you have to beat someone down in order for someone to take something that is good for them? Sure, it takes time for people to make different choices, but the idea that you have to build a business model in a care system by criminalizing people is an industry that we don't talk enough about. So oftentimes the same people that are talking about big tobacco, big alcohol, and trying to scare us about big cannabis are people that are funded and are committed to big treatment, which is in bed with big prisons and big jails.
Yeah. Robin, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the decriminalization measure in Colorado this year with the psychedelics. What's the sentiment on the ground? Like, what is your feel for, like, do you think it's gonna pass? And like, what do you think about the measure more broadly?
Well, I worry that it's replicating where we started with cannabis, which is it's saying it's decriminalized to use, but it will mythically drop from the sky. There's no place you can legally buy it. It's illegal to still transfer it or sell it. So it creates the right to use without any source that controls for quality, that controls for dosing. It also requires use under a care provider, and the good intent there is that care provider isn't just a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist. It includes folks who've gone through training, which is important for communities like our Native American communities in the Southwest who've been using these substances for many years. I don't want them to have to get a college degree, but I also think this is a pretty new space, this therapeutic use of these drugs, and I don't know that a 20 or 40-hour training is sufficient for someone with no background in therapy. So I, myself, am not able to support the measure because I feel like it's not quite there in terms of making sure that the folks who are going to be needing and seeking out this service are safe in terms of how they acquire these substances and who they're doing supervised sessions with. There is also an opposition movement from the very folks Kassandra's been describing who see this as a setup for corporate control and don't feel that it creates the right pathways. So it has both conservative opponents and those from the decriminalization movement who don't feel like it's to their standard. And so it's complex. And ultimately, the voters are going to decide. And so I think that what I know is arresting people for the use of psychedelics isn't a good policy answer. It's a question of, what, and I'm a realist, I'm a legislator. I make compromises with colleagues. I, try to find progress that I can build on later. I'm not a person who practices things must be perfect in order to move forward. But I do think that I can't endorse something feeling these deep concerns. So I'm in the awkward position of not supporting that measure while also believing that the criminal justice approach we have to psilocybin and the other substances that are listed in it is ludicrous.
Mm-hmm. Tera, do you have any advice for policymakers who are thinking about decriminalization policies more broadly? I mean, the one in Colorado is a ballot measure, but let's say there was a group that is trying to craft a different ballot measure, or even a legislature that is debating a bill about such a policy. What are some of the things that you've learned from your experience in Oregon that you think would be good to be, top of mind?
I would say you're welcome.
You really should say that.
We are getting all the arguments out on the table as quick as possible so that we'll know kind of what you need to do. Like I said, Oregon is unique in its own space because we're worst in access and have highest addiction rates. That being said, we've heard a lot of you put the cart before the horse, which means you should have had all your services set up perfectly and well-funded, and then you should have decriminalized the drugs. So Oregon arrests 9,000 people for possession a year, and this year I think it was about 2,000 after Measure 110 went in. So that's 7,000 people who don't have barriers on their record, who 16,000 people were able to access services because of the initial funds from ballot measure 110. 60% of them were harm reduction and overdose prevention services. So I think the idea, I agree on one hand of it needs to make sense, right? Your measure and your policy needs to make sense, and you can't wait forever to implement because there are real harms being caused by criminalization. And while we're causing those harms, people can't wait for us sitting in a room coming up with the perfect policy components to see how they'll fit, because people aren't apt to wanting to decriminalize for multiple reasons, right? You get the treatment complex saying, oh, we have a very specific way of doing things, and this is the only way we can do things because we're making money. You've got prisons and jails saying, oh, we have to do it this way. And so everybody's benefiting from it except for the folks who are getting criminalized and who aren't being able to access the services. So I'd say that bring people who use drugs, who have been impacted most by the war on drugs, to the table to craft your policies. Don't do this in a vacuum. It's okay to also have all of the different perspectives. We had a really great stakeholder group when we were crafting it as legislation after the ballot measure passed. And we had cities and counties, corrections officers, criminal justice advocates, community of color organizations. Everybody was at the table to make sure that we were centering health and not criminal justice as we were creating our policy. And so I would say, don't believe the hype. It's not scary. It is a thing that we have to do. We have been harming communities for way too long, and it's the right next step, and that, we should all be in there together and figuring it out. But ultimately, if your goal is to support people, support communities, it's not that hard. So that would be my...
Yeah. And I have one last question before we go to Q&A. I feel like we've been talking a lot about, how these measures are funded and the corporate influence and how, that sort of talking point is used on people across the political spectrum. And then also you have this debate between, decrim and, regulating an industry and what happens when the industry funds reform. Kassandra, how can we think about this issue in a more creative way, in a way that isn't just decrim or big industry interests?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. What I will say is I think we legalized cannabis conceding a lot about what the industry or what regulation will look like. We were just like, cool, let's just regulate it like the other substances that we know, right? And I think there is a U-shaped graph that we look at where it's like prohibition, corporate capture. Where we want to be is somewhere in the middle, right? We don't want to prohibit drugs. We also don't want corporate capture from our vantage point of the social justice folks. We want to be in a space where we are removing criminalization, moving towards regulation, but not putting public health and public safety at risk. And I think that that's why we're having a lot of conversations about the different derivatives of cannabis, like Delta-8, right? That's why we're having conversations about the potency levels, right? Because we're trying to, the industry is creating regulation in a way that's like, how do we give people the biggest high, the most money, and get people to want our product, right? Remember that their business model is for you to buy things, for you to use things, right? And for us, we're also not just focused on that. We didn't do regulation for business. We did regulation because we thought that was the best way to make sure that people were safe. People deserve to know what they put in their bodies. We believe in people's right, their ability for their personal sovereignty. We also think that criminalization is messed up. And so one of the things that's really exciting about this moment is, what does regulation look like outside of capitalism? What are the different kinds of ways that we can build regulation? What are the different kinds of ways that we can build sustainable economies that are not based in extraction? And so what you're seeing, and what are some of the conversations that people are having, is like, what are the kinds of things or the different kinds of regulation that we can put forward so that not everything is like conceding to the fact that there will be a big industry? What if everything is craft? What if something is state run, right? Like, there are different models of regulation, and we have to give ourselves the opportunity to have those conversations, as opposed to think like, well, this is how we did it in 2012, and so therefore, this is how everything has to be. And so that is the part of the conversation that groups like Drug Policy Alliance, Health Justice Recovery Alliance, SSDP, Parabola Center, MPP, like, we're all having these conversations about like, What are different models of regulation? And then also, one of the things that we didn't talk about today is recognizing that the US is a consumer country. Most of the drugs that we consume are not from here. Other countries are producing our drugs. And so when we move into a regulatory market, how are we taking into consideration the farmers in Colombia? Not the university in Harlem, Colombia, the country, right? What are we thinking about Mexico, right? Not only are those countries producing the substances that are coming here that people are using, but we are also exporting the criminalization in those countries as well. And so the United States cannot build a regulatory model in a vacuum. So when you're talking about, it can't be just, you can't do the regulatory model in a vacuum where you have to bring drug users and families and all kinds of people. In the US, we need to bring other countries into the conversation because they have been our supply for a long time. We have driven production all across the world. We have wreaked havoc. And so it's not just the corporate capture. We have, we have the Sacklers and all that stuff, but we also have the US DOJ and federal government and US aid that have industrialized the drug war. And when we talk about regulation, we really need to figure out what is a way for us to do this in a way that's not extractive, not exploitative, and doesn't kill our climate.
All right, I want to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, please come up to the mic.
I can't see shit.
I can't either.
Sorry. Oh, I'm on the mic.
Hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Tera. I'm a first-year student at the Hurst School of Public Policy. Thanks for coming. This was really interesting. I was hoping, you said something a little bit before, but I was hoping you could speak more to like effective ways for destigmatization, because I think we talk on a high level that these laws are being passed, but I feel like in regular conversations, it's not really something that we are open to admitting to a lot of people, unless it was like in a really private space. So maybe in your work where you've found success in terms of appealing to a destigmatization. Thanks.
I'll just give one very small example. I spoke with the LGBTQ organization Spectrum right before this, and in terms of an interesting connection, I'm an out elected official, and I think that there is something about the way that a personal connection and a family connection, and so has been changed hearts and minds about LGBTQ rights, and I think something similar can be said, right? So you love someone who struggles with addiction. I bet there's no one in this room who doesn't know someone that they cared about who struggled with it in their family, their friend group. And so would this have been the path for them to throw them in jail? Would it have changed their life? Or would you have preferred them to have a compassionate path with the services and treatment, right? And so I do think that, I won't speak to coming out about someone's own drug use in the same way, but I do think invoking family is something that, thinking about who you know and what you'd want for them, that is something that I believe is persuasive in a political policy debate like this.
I also think that, yes to all of that, and I also think that so many people use drugs, and so many people have different ideas about what counts as a drug, right? I think now some people don't even count cannabis as a drug, right? But I think part of the conversation, one of the programs we used to have was Safer Partying, which is like when people go out to these music festivals, one of the things that we've been doing is bringing harm reduction services to there, because we know people use drugs there. We want people to test their drugs, and we want to give people education about drugs. So one of the things that I think is really important, in addition to what the council member was talking about, is that I do think it's important for some people that have the ability to identify, right? Or people to have conversations or ask questions or create spaces where people can ask questions about things. I think one of a good model for that was around reproductive health when people did Go Ask Alice, right? And like giving people the opportunity, because part of the reason why people are dying is because they don't have the space to ask questions. But I think it's also important to recognize that most people who use drugs don't end up having an addiction. 80% of people who use drugs don't have an addiction. They are either experimenting or they use recreationally. So I think part of the conversation is how do we talk about that 80%? Because we spend so much of our time talking about the 20% that takes up a lot of emotional feelings because it's so difficult. but most people that use drugs don't struggle with drugs. And so how do we create the space in our community to have that? And I think that's about talking about it.
And I would just add, as a person in long-term recovery, I stopped using drugs at probably a lot of your ages, and went into treatment. And so for me, it's always been about, once I felt more solid in my own program and my own, recovery, was talking to people about it. And first, it was the fear of talking to my employers about it. And are they gonna, fire me because of this? And every time that didn't happen, and people just said, oh, that's great, it helped me. And so then, I try and do that in my space because I am in a privileged position to say that and to talk about it. And, I think the other piece for stigmatization, we didn't talk about this stuff when I first went into the different programs, right? And now it's so nice to sit down with a legislator and be like, all right, here's what detox means. Here's why I went to detox. Here was my experience about detox, without shame. I mean, I think if we've learned anything from Brene Brown, shame is not a good motivator. So why do we keep using it? And I have had to practice what I preach because my son is 16. And I have to have that conversation with him on a daily basis. Shame is not a motivator, so I need him to be safe, right? It's the same as we do with sex ed. I want you to be safe. I'm not gonna preach abstinence only, but let's talk about the risks. And let's talk about how to keep you safe. Do you have naloxone in your backpack? Are you able to support a friend if they need help? And I think that stigmatization gets smashed the more that we put light on it. And that's just the reality of it. And, kind of having those conversations and wading in and trying not to come from a place of shame or stigma, but a place of openness. I've changed a lot just in the 2 years that I've been in this space because I was very abstinence only and now have really learned, and personally I still am, but now I've really gotten to a bigger place of it's a spectrum, it's a continuum, and that's okay. And so how do we continue to have these conversations? I'm really grateful to Decrim because it has created an opportunity for us to have these conversations in a real way and to connect with people on a human level, because this is a human issue, and just talk about it and work through that. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Graham Harwood. I'm a second year in the public policy school. Sorry to get a little wonky on you for a second, but HR 8200, the CLIMB Act, is supposed to create a safe harbor for financial services companies to provide funding for growers and all these types of, activities. You guys talked a lot about the issues at getting access to capital, but also the issues of corporatization. How do you think about crafting kind of those safe harbor provisions where state law and federal law overlap while not privileging companies that already have access to capital and those relationships?
No? Okay. I think you're looking at me. Yeah. I think we're in a very interesting moment where we're doing regulation in states that doesn't have federal regulation, right? And so states are starting their own businesses, and the federal government has the ability to come out and just mess everything up. And I think that it is important for us to kind of get to a place where we are able to protect small businesses to be able to continue to grow. I think I am not sophisticated enough on the legislation that you named, but I would say that Shailene Title at the Parabola Center is someone that has written on this extensively, and I pretty much do whatever she says. So her position is my position.
And also, Dashita Dawson has written some good pieces on this issue too, I think, that really explore, what does it mean to give a safe harbor to financial institutions when, You know, a lot of these programs are aimed at helping marginalized people or people who are somehow economically disadvantaged. But if you offer banks a safe harbor to serve the industry, they're still going to look at someone's creditworthiness.
Yeah.
Like, they're still not going to want to lend to someone who like doesn't have good credit or doesn't have something to like guarantee a loan against. So I mean, these are sort of some like broader systemic issues that are still there, regardless of whether there is a safe harbor or not.
Are you asking me about the SAFE Act?
The Climb
The
Act.
different Climb Act. I was like, because I'm against that one, but yeah, Climb Act, yeah, cool.
Similar issues, but go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alejandro. I'm also a second-year public policy student. And, well, thanks all of you for this conference and your work. My question touches on Kassandra's last point on the global dimension of the war on drugs. And I feel like there's a huge mismatch between state-level decriminalization and US foreign policy still. And I mean, the US, as we know, has been the main proponent of the UN drug conventions, and global prohibition is still one of its axes in foreign policy. So my question is, do you believe that in the long run, state-level decriminalization will result in a shift in US foreign policy? We have developments of legalization in Mexico and in Colombia, even of cocaine in Colombia, and I haven't seen anything at the US foreign policy level regarding this development, so I was just curious about your opinion.
The US drug policy reform movement is not currently accountable to the global drug policy movement. And so there are not that many people that are working on US foreign policy. And I do not think that state-level decriminalization is actually going to translate into US foreign policy, just the same as state-level legalization has not translated into US foreign policy on cannabis. What I will tell you is that that is shifting, and that DPA is actually taking on the conversation of what US foreign policy looks like and building an apparatus and a work plan with other countries in the global south. I just came back from Mexico City and I went to Bogota in May because we're building out that conversation because, you know, as someone who has fought for reparations in the US owes the global south a lot of reparations around the drug war, and it's incumbent on US drug policy reformers to force our government to add that as part of their conversation.
Hi, my name is Tyler Shastine. I'm a first year in the college. And I wanted to ask you a question, Tera. I wanted to talk about the very interesting political year it is for Oregon. It's, commonly accepted as a blue state, generally speaking. However, the governor's race this year is very close. One reason being that the biggest reason being that it's a three-way race between a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent, who's a former Democrat running as an independent. And the issue of Measure 110 has taken center stage in this debate. And it seems likely that the two candidates, the Republican, Christine Drazan, and the independent, Betsy Johnson, have both said that they are adamantly supportive of repealing Measure 110. And they're likely to get combined over 50% of the vote, as it is a three-way race. What do you say to the independent voters that the Democrats seem to have lost on the issue of Measure 110 when it comes to facts such as the rollout on the grants that the state has been giving out for these programs has been rather slow, and the rise in overdose deaths by 41% the year after this measure was implemented? What do you say to those independent voters who the Democratic Party seems to have lost in Oregon?
Okay, that's a lot, and there's a lot of answers for it. So I believe that Betsy Johnson is not an independent. I don't think the independent party endorsed her. So I think that that's important. It's not necessarily fully relevant in this conversation. We just, there was a poll done by Data for Progress about a month ago that actually shows that there's still really strong support, bipartisan support for keeping Measure 110 on the books, even with all of the media that is surrounding it. And so 58% of Oregonians still support keeping Measure 110 going. 58% of Oregonians voted for it 2 years ago. They still believe in all and strongly support all of the different services that Measure 110 provides. And that's across the board. That's not a red and blue thing. That is I want people to have access to housing, safe, transitional, supportive housing. I want people to have access to peer mentors. I want people to have access to low barrier treatment options. I want people to have access to harm reduction. Blue, red, independent, didn't matter, strong support. Now, we're in a space of a vacuum where we're still in a global pandemic, but we're coming out of our lockdown. Nobody wants to talk about it because voters are tired of it. But it still happened. We can't wish it away. We are seeing a result of, massive evictions, mental health undiagnosed and untreated, medical undiagnosed and untreated. I mean, we have never been in a situation like this before. And it's not just happening in Oregon. If it was just happening in Oregon, I would have more of a conversation of like, you have a point there. It's happening everywhere. And these are the fear tactics, and these are the things that are happening. I mean, we have been blamed for homelessness, drug overdose deaths, and crime rates. It's happening across the country. It's a national trend. Oregon is actually is tracking a little bit under in overdose death rates when you look at the whole West Coast. Mm-hmm. So again, it's really important to dig, and especially as folks who are in this space, in our public policy space, to that sounds a little bit strange because I'm pretty sure I read that in New York State as well, or I saw that in California as well. We have a lot of human suffering in Oregon, especially on the West Coast. Fentanyl is just hitting the West Coast. And I was just talking to my friends over dinner, and they live here, and they said, oh yeah, we've been dealing with fentanyl for a really long time. Yeah. So the overdose death rates are not they're heartbreaking, but they're not surprising. And you know what? 16,000 people got services because of Measure 110. 60% of those were harm reduction. That means that there were more people in the streets doing outreach, handing out Narcan, handing out naloxone, saving lives because of Measure 110. Were the funds out slow? Yes. Did I have so many more gray hairs, and I have nobody at the health authority who will talk to me anymore because of the funds getting out so late? Because I was such a thorn in their side, but they're out. They got out by September. We have people expanding. We have some organizations that are hiring 67 new peers and outreach workers. We have people buying houses. We're gonna have a house for African American women for the first time for recovery and transitional housing, right? These are the things that you're not hearing in the larger landscape, but we didn't lose the independents. We didn't lose the Democrats. And we still have a good solid amount of Republicans. What you're seeing is the Democrats going towards their base, the Republicans singing to their base, and Betsy Johnson being a complete spoiler in this race and could end up costing Oregonians severely in so many different areas, including the climate work that we've done, all the way to funding harm reduction and addiction treatment services. So we haven't lost anybody. There's a loud scapegoating happening, and people need to give this time. And I think that going back to the earlier question of what would you tell policymakers, take your time. These things are not happening because of one policy. I wish these kinds of things we could be like, that's the policy, we just need to erase it, and everything else will be fine. This is end-stage capitalism and a global pandemic. So I could talk about this for a long time. I'll be quiet.
Hi there, my name is Zach. I'm a third year in the college. So my question is, basically I'm 2/3 through the book by Dr. Carl Hart. I don't know if, right. And among other things, he talks about the overstatement of addiction and other things, but fundamentally he talks about the right to pursuit of happiness, like, from the Declaration of Independence. So I guess coming at this from another angle, what do you say to those who say that, the drug decriminalization movement has not gone far enough? That, like, I'm from New York, it's, weed is the only drug, it seems like, that's legal, right? Like,
You're welcome.
But what would you say to those who, say it doesn't go far enough, I guess, like hard drugs, like, I don't know, other stuff, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, we agree with you. It takes a lot of work. Join us. Pretty much, right? Like, it takes work. New York took 10 years. Next.
So 3 more questions, and we have about 5 minutes, so please try to keep it brief, but I want to get to everyone.
Thank you. My question is for Kassandra. Thank you so much to all for being here. I'm from Mexico, and my sister and I have recently been in the process of acquiring a legal permit to grow cannabis. It has been very slow and very painful. Our lawyers have told us that ours has been especially slow and painful, and we have some reason to believe it is because we are young women of color who are maybe the first to be requiring this process from our state. So I'm just wondering and pulling a little bit from what you said earlier on how the U.S. is a different climate because it is a consumer country and not a producer country. So ours is a very different climate. Words of advice as a young woman of color in this issue for other women who are trying to do the same. Thank you.
I think one of the biggest things that I can offer you is that there are a lot of women of color that are trying to be in the industry space and sharing a lot of information and helping folks. So I think that you should really plug into the different communities that people are doing. Like, there are different organizations like Women Grow, the Hood Incubator, Cannabis Collective. There are folks that are actively working and leveraging resources to really get people the information that they need. And so I wouldn't do it in a vacuum, because there are a lot of people that could probably make some different shortcuts for you because they've already gotten that forward.
Hi, I'm Shimul. I'm a first-year student of public policy at Harris. I guess my question was more, something that fascinates me about this is the idea of relapsing, and especially about how circumstance sometimes pushes people to drug use, and especially to addiction, because I think dependence is a whole different thing from just maybe using it recreationally, because there's a fine line between being able to rationalize out of it, perhaps. So something that strikes me from a policy perspective is regulation or decriminalization. It's great. I think it's fantastic to be able to decriminalize because it takes away from the stigma and a lot of different negatives attached to it. But does it really help with maybe making it preventative, especially in terms of relapse? How are we looking at it from a public health perspective is more of my question. So I just wanted to know your perspective on that.
I really appreciate that question, because I think as a local government policymaker, I think that I am screaming at the top of my lungs, where is the healthcare system, right? Where is the healthcare system? So for those who are using because they experience untreated depression and anxiety, for those who are using because they have ADD, our medical system is nowhere on the scene. And these challenges, right? So there is a challenge with fentanyl use and street homelessness. It's real. And I don't have a single tool at the local government to answer that. Not one. And yet we're in the front lines. So I think that we should be putting as much pressure on our federal healthcare regulation system to really be thinking about all kinds of things. Research, right? One of the reasons I'm a little concerned about our psilocybin approach is because we're just now starting to have clinical trials about that. Why don't we have more clinical trials? Why don't we understand more about who actually is most at risk of addiction if they use a substance compared to those who don't? We know there are some genetic and biological factors, but we don't know very much about it. And so I think that, not to take away from decriminalization, but you can tell I'm on fire here because we are barking up all the wrong trees, and we are really letting healthcare off the We're letting them off their responsibility. And your measure is funding it, but I don't know if it's doing that transformational piece of pushing the healthcare industry, let's go back to that word industry, to do their part, or if it's just bringing state money in.
So I would say there's a couple issues. One is that the good news with decrim is that it starts helping us with the reducing stigma. Medicaid still reimburses folks less for addiction treatment than mental health, and mental health is low. So we do not, it is a stigmatized field because we don't care about people who use drugs, right? And so we need to change that. So I 100% agree. Like, we can put Band-Aids on the issue. Again, why I don't think that 110 created homelessness is it was so many things, right? And we have to start working on all of those issues. What 110 is doing, though, is creating a system of care that really is driven by people with lived experience. And so it's really going towards that. We know relapse happens. Let's not shame people when they relapse. Let's be there for them, right? Which is new. And let's make sure that we have everything from just a dignified approach to, hey, what do you need to stay safe? All the way to, are you ready for kind of do you need and do you want wraparound services? So I think that what 110 can help show is what services when community is pushing for services looks like, and not when the healthcare industry is pushing for services like big treatment. Everybody needs to go to 28 days. This is the way it goes. And so the other thing that 110 is these are non-Medicaid services. These are things that people weren't funding. So we need to do a whole Medicaid overhaul, so you guys can work on that. But it's true. These aren't in a vacuum. They're not silos, and that's the problem, and there's red.
One last question.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I'm also a first-year MPP from Harris. I'm from Indiana, where we have yet to decriminalize marijuana. We had 19 bills enter our legislature last year, none of which even made it out of committee. And so my question is, it's just a matter of time for conservative states like mine before decriminalization happens, or is there some other legal strategy that needs to happen in these states in order for us to reach even decriminalization?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the biggest things that's really important and that I would offer you, and shout out to the New Yorker, is that before we were able to pass any law in New York, we changed the conversation in the state. And we forced our local cities to do different things. So before we even decriminalized cannabis, we started the campaign in 2010. And before we decriminalized cannabis, which honestly went into effect in 2019, we had 51,000 arrests. But the arrests, as not Mona, you said, we dropped the arrests by a significant point because we changed the conversation in our local communities. So what I would say is, if your state legislature is lagging behind, as they always do, no offense, I think it's important for you to look at what are municipal strategies that you can do. And as a student, there's an organization that works on drug policy called Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And they have municipal strategies that they offer students to really look at. Can you go in your city, talk to your city council, talk to your teachers, talk to the people that you know in your neighborhood, start having the conversation, start destigmatizing it, and figure out ways for you to move something, right? If it's either getting your local police station to say, we are gonna make cannabis the lowest enforcement priority. If you can get your district attorney to say, we're gonna decline to prosecute marijuana charges. If you can get your mayor to say, these are different things that we're gonna do, figure out if you can start getting administrative changes, even if the state is moving, and then that also builds a lot of momentum. In New York, we went New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, Long Island, Westchester. We hit those cities over and over and over again, and it finally built the momentum for us to actually push change. But you get stuck for a really long time if you just go for the state legislature, because they're not motivated to do it. You have to make them do it. And so that start small, look at your municipality and try to shift it.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you all so much for coming out and all your great questions.